How does a religion born from failed predictions manage to become one of the most influential religious organizations present in over 200 countries? The answer doesn't lie solely in the faith of its members, but in a corporate mind that changed everything from within. This is the story of Nathan Knorr, a man who didn't preach like previous leaders but transformed the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society into a true multinational corporation, complete with all the administrative efficiency and cold calculation that such a designation implies. For those who lived within the organization's walls, the transformation under Knorr represents something far more complex than spiritual growth. It marked the moment when a religious movement fully embraced corporate methodology, treating believers not as a flock to be shepherded, but as human resources to be managed, territories to be conquered, and markets to be penetrated. The implications of this shift continue to reverberate through the lives of millions who found themselves caught in a system that prioritized expansion over pastoral care, efficiency over empathy, and statistical success over individual spiritual well-being. The corporate transformation that occurred under Knorr's leadership wasn't merely cosmetic or organizational. It was fundamental and philosophical. Previous leaders had operated with the assumption that they were building a religious community. Knorr operated with the understanding that he was constructing a business enterprise that happened to deal in spiritual products. This distinction may seem subtle, but its implications were revolutionary and continue to shape the experience of millions of believers worldwide. The methodology that Knorr introduced wasn't borrowed from other religious organizations. It was lifted directly from the corporate playbook of mid-20th century American business. He studied successful companies, analyzed their operational strategies, and systematically applied their methods to religious administration. The result was an organization that functioned more like IBM or General Motors than like traditional religious institutions, with all the efficiency and dehumanization that such a comparison implies. Nathan Knorr was born in 1905 in the small town of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, a location whose biblical name seems almost prophetic in hindsight. Yet there was nothing particularly spiritual about young Knorr's trajectory. His family background was middle-class Protestant, unremarkable in its conventionality. What distinguished young Nathan wasn't religious fervor or spiritual insight, but a methodical mind that gravitated naturally toward systems and organization. At just 16 years old, he entered the Watchtower's headquarters in Brooklyn, New York, not as a zealous preacher or charismatic speaker, but as someone who understood systems, processes, and the mechanics of organization. This early entry into the Bethel environment proved crucial to his later success. While other young men his age were exploring teenage interests or pursuing conventional education, Knorr was receiving an intensive education in religious administration from the inside. The Brooklyn Bethel of the 1920s was already a complex operation, but it retained many characteristics of an extended family or religious commune. Under Judge Rutherford's leadership, the organization operated with a mixture of autocratic control and informal personal relationships. Knorr observed this environment with the analytical eye of someone naturally inclined toward systematic thinking. He saw inefficiencies, inconsistencies, and missed opportunities that escaped the notice of more spiritually minded residents. While others sought recognition through public speaking or doctrinal debates, Knorr distinguished himself through an entirely different skill set: administrative excellence. He was practical, efficient, and possessed an intuitive understanding of how to organize complex processes. These weren't necessarily spiritual gifts, but they would prove far more valuable to the organization's future than any amount of theological insight or preaching ability. Knorr's administrative talents became apparent in his handling of routine operational matters. He could streamline shipping procedures, improve inventory management, and coordinate complex logistics with remarkable efficiency. More importantly, he began to see patterns and possibilities that others missed. Where his colleagues saw religious activities, Knorr saw business processes that could be optimized, systematized, and scaled. During the 1920s and 1930s, Knorr quietly accumulated responsibilities and influence within the organization. He wasn't seeking the spotlight, he was building competence in areas that others found tedious or unimportant. While Judge Rutherford was delivering fiery speeches and engaging in theological controversies, Knorr was learning the nuts and bolts of running what was already becoming a significant publishing enterprise. This practical approach to religious administration would later prove revolutionary, though not necessarily in ways that benefited individual believers. Knorr understood that passion and charisma could build a movement, but only systematic organization could sustain and expand it indefinitely. He was studying to become not a spiritual father, but a corporate executive who happened to work in the religious sector. The transformation in Knorr's thinking during these formative years represented a fundamental shift in how religious leadership could be conceptualized. Previous Watchtower leaders had seen themselves as spiritual guides or prophetic figures. Knorr began to see himself as a manager of human and material resources. This difference in self-conception would ultimately reshape the entire organization and the experience of millions of believers. The 1942 takeover. A new era begins. When Joseph Franklin Rutherford died in January 1942, the Watchtower organization faced a critical juncture that would determine its entire future trajectory. Rutherford had been a larger-than-life figure, bombastic, controversial, and utterly dominating. His leadership style had been intensely personal, driven by charisma and force of personality rather than systematic administration. His death left a vacuum that many expected would be filled by another charismatic leader in the same mold. The selection of Nathan Knorr as Rutherford's successor was not inevitable. Other candidates possessed superior speaking abilities, greater theological knowledge, or more extensive preaching experience. But Knorr possessed something that proved more valuable to the organization's board of directors: demonstrated competence in the practical aspects of organizational management. His selection represented a conscious choice to prioritize administrative efficiency over spiritual charisma. At just 37 years old, Knorr assumed the presidency and immediately signaled that a fundamentally different era was beginning. The changes weren't dramatic or sudden, they were systematic and methodical, reflecting Knorr's analytical approach to organizational leadership. Within months of taking control, he had initiated comprehensive reviews of every aspect of the organization's operations, from literature production to field service coordination. The contrast with previous leadership couldn't have been more stark. Where Charles Taze Russell had been the visionary founder and Rutherford the explosive agitator, Knorr was something entirely new: the executive. His style was less pastoral and more reminiscent of a CEO taking control of a major corporation. This wasn't merely a difference in personality. It represented a fundamental shift in how the organization viewed itself and its mission. Knorr's early initiatives revealed his corporate mindset. He eliminated inefficiencies in the printing operation, streamlined distribution systems, and implemented cost control measures that would have been familiar to any business manager of the era. More significantly, he began to analyze the organization's market position and develop strategies for expanding market share, though he never used such explicitly commercial terminology in public. The transformation under Knorr wasn't simply about improving existing operations, it was about reconceptualizing the entire enterprise. Previous leaders had built a religious movement. Knorr was constructing a business platform that could support unlimited expansion. The shift was subtle but profound, and its implications would become apparent only gradually as the new systems were implemented. Knorr's ascension marked the moment when the Watchtower stopped pretending to be primarily a religious movement and began operating as a business enterprise that happened to deal in spiritual products. The implications were immediate and far-reaching. Decision-making processes became more centralized, standardized, and detached from local needs or individual circumstances. The personal touch that had characterized earlier leadership was replaced by corporate efficiency. For believers at the time, this transition may have seemed like mere organizational growing pains or necessary modernization. In retrospect, however, it represented the beginning of a systematic approach to human management that would eventually touch every aspect of a Jehovah's Witness's life. Knorr wasn't interested in shepherding souls. He was building a machine capable of processing human beings according to predetermined specifications. One of Knorr's first major initiatives was the complete restructuring of the organization's administrative framework. This wasn't a simple reorganization or efficiency improvement. It was a fundamental reimagining of how a religious organization could operate. He created departments, established clear hierarchies, and implemented reporting systems that would have been familiar to any corporate manager of the era, but were revolutionary in the context of religious administration. The Watchtower was systematically divided into functional areas: publishing, legal, construction, and field service, each with its own management structure and performance metrics. This departmentalization served multiple purposes beyond simple efficiency. It allowed for specialization and expertise development, but more importantly, it centralized control by ensuring that all major decisions flowed through clearly defined channels that ultimately led to the presidential office. The creation of the legal department represented a particularly significant development. Under previous administrations, legal matters had been handled on an ad hoc basis, often by outside counsel. Knorr recognized that an expanding organization would face increasingly complex legal challenges and that in-house legal capability was essential for maintaining control and protecting organizational interests. The legal department became one of the most powerful and secretive arms of the organization, developing strategies for dealing with everything from tax issues to child abuse allegations. The construction department represented another innovation that revealed Knorr's long-term thinking. Rather than contracting external companies for building projects, he created an internal capability that could construct kingdom halls, assembly halls, and branch facilities according to standardized specifications. This provided cost savings, but more importantly, it ensured complete control over the physical infrastructure that would house the organization's operations. Local autonomy, which had existed to some degree under previous administrations, was systematically eliminated through the implementation of standardized procedures and centralized oversight. Congregations that had once enjoyed some measure of independence found themselves subject to increasingly detailed supervision and required to follow precise operational guidelines that left little room for local adaptation or initiative. The genius of Knorr's approach lay not just in its efficiency, but in its scalability. By creating standardized processes and procedures, he made it possible for the organization to expand rapidly without losing central control. Every new congregation could be brought online quickly because the operational manual was already written. Every new country could be penetrated because the methodology was already proven and tested. The implementation of performance metrics represented another corporate innovation that transformed the religious experience for individual believers. Every aspect of organizational activity, from literature distribution to meeting attendance to preaching hours, was quantified, tracked, and reported. This created an environment where spiritual activity was reduced to statistical data that could be analyzed and optimized like any other business process. But this systematization came at a cost that wouldn't become fully apparent for decades. The human element, the pastoral care, the individual attention, the flexibility to address unique circumstances, was gradually squeezed out of the organization. Efficiency became the highest virtue, and efficiency rarely accommodates human complexity or individual needs. The corporate machine that Knorr was building required standardized inputs and produced predictable outputs, but human beings proved resistant to such systematic processing. The reporting systems that Knorr implemented created a culture of surveillance and accountability that extended far beyond organizational boundaries into the personal lives of individual believers. Every aspect of spiritual activity was monitored and evaluated, creating an environment where performance anxiety became a constant feature of religious life. The corporate obsession with measurable results transformed voluntary religious activity into mandatory productivity quotas. In 1943, just 1 year after assuming leadership, Knorr established what would become one of his most significant innovations, the Watchtower Bible School of Gilead. On the surface, this appeared to be a traditional missionary training program, similar to those operated by other religious organizations. In reality, it was something far more systematic and calculating. A human manufacturing process designed to produce standardized missionary products according to precise organizational specifications. The concept for Gilead emerged from Knorr's analysis of the organization's expansion challenges. Traditional missionary efforts had been individualistic and unpredictable, with varying degrees of success depending on the personal qualities and cultural adaptability of individual missionaries. Knorr recognized that such an approach was incompatible with systematic global expansion. What was needed was a standardized training program that could reliably produce missionaries capable of implementing predetermined organizational strategies regardless of local conditions. The Gilead School wasn't designed to produce pastors or spiritual counselors in any traditional sense. It was designed to manufacture missionaries, human products trained to specific standards and deployed according to corporate strategy. The curriculum was intensive, highly disciplined, and completely standardized. Students didn't learn to think critically about doctrine or develop their own theological perspectives. They learned to implement predetermined programs with maximum efficiency and minimum deviation from organizational protocols. The selection process for Gilead students revealed the corporate mentality underlying the program. Candidates weren't chosen primarily for their spiritual maturity or theological insight, but for their demonstrated ability to follow instructions, implement programs, and maintain organizational loyalty under challenging conditions. The ideal Gilead student was someone who could function effectively as a franchise manager in a foreign territory, not someone who might develop independent theological perspectives or adapt organizational methods to local conditions. The training methodology employed at Gilead was remarkably similar to corporate management training programs of the era. Students learned organizational procedures, communication protocols, and implementation strategies. They were drilled in the proper responses to common situations and trained to recognize and report deviations from organizational standards. The emphasis was on uniformity, predictability, and control rather than on creativity, adaptation, or individual spiritual development. The results were immediate and dramatic. Graduates of Gilead were dispatched to Latin America, Africa, and Asia with military precision. They carried with them not just religious beliefs, but complete operational systems, organizational structures, literature distribution networks, and recruitment strategies. Each missionary became a franchise manager, establishing local operations according to headquarters specifications without significant regard for local customs or cultural sensitivities. This systematic approach to global expansion represented something unprecedented in religious history. Previous missionary efforts had often been individualistic, with missionaries adapting their message and methods to local conditions through trial and error. Knorr's Gilead graduates, by contrast, were implementing a standardized corporate expansion plan that had been developed, tested, and refined in headquarters before being deployed globally. The Gilead program also served important internal functions within the organization. It created a cadre of specially trained personnel who owed their positions and status directly to headquarters rather than to local relationships or community standing. These Gilead graduates often became the most reliable enforcers of organizational policy in their assigned territories, functioning as extension of central control rather than as local spiritual leaders. The human cost of this approach would become apparent only gradually. Missionaries trained in the Gilead method often struggled to provide meaningful pastoral care because they had been trained as administrators and program implementers, not as shepherds. Their primary loyalty was to organizational objectives rather than to the spiritual welfare of local believers, creating conflicts that often remained hidden but affected the quality of spiritual life in congregations around the world. Local believers found themselves subject to foreign management styles that showed little sensitivity to their cultural context or individual needs. The standardized approaches that Gilead graduates had been trained to implement often conflicted with local customs and expectations, creating tensions that were typically resolved in favor of organizational uniformity rather than cultural accommodation. Knorr understood something that many religious leaders miss. In the modern world, whoever controls information controls minds. This insight led him to transform the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society into one of the world's largest publishing enterprises, rivaling major commercial publishers in terms of output, distribution efficiency, and market penetration. But this wasn't simply about spreading religious ideas. It was about creating a comprehensive information ecosystem that could shape thinking at every level. The publishing operation that Knorr inherited was already substantial, but it operated more like a traditional religious publisher, producing materials in response to immediate needs or inspiration. Knorr transformed this reactive approach into a proactive, strategic operation that functioned more like a modern media conglomerate. He implemented long-range editorial planning, market analysis, and coordinated multimedia campaigns that would have been familiar to any commercial publisher of the era. The Watchtower magazine became the flagship publication of this empire, printed in dozens of languages with circulation figures that would be the envy of any commercial publication. But the magazine was just the tip of an enormous publishing iceberg that included books, brochures, pamphlets, audio recordings, and eventually video materials. Each category of publication served specific strategic purposes in a comprehensive program of information control and mind shaping. The genius of Knorr's publishing strategy lay in its systematic nature. Literature wasn't produced haphazardly or in response to immediate needs. Instead, it was part of a coordinated campaign designed to shape thinking patterns and behavioral responses over time. Each publication reinforced organizational authority while gradually eliminating independent thought or local adaptation. The publishing schedule was carefully planned to create psychological momentum and maintain constant engagement with organizational messaging. The production process itself revealed the corporate mentality underlying the operation. Writing committees were established to ensure consistency and eliminate individual authorial voice. Editorial processes were implemented to guarantee conformity to organizational doctrine and policy. Quality control systems were developed to prevent deviation from approved messaging. The result was literature that read more like corporate communications than traditional religious writing. Local congregations became distribution points for this corporate literature, but they lost the ability to produce their own teaching materials or adapt central messages to local conditions. The standardization was complete, A Jehovah's Witness in Brazil would study exactly the same material, in exactly the same sequence, as a witness in Nigeria or Japan. Local languages might differ, but the thinking patterns were identical. This control of information extended beyond doctrinal matters to include practical guidance on everything from family relationships to career choices. The organization wasn't content to govern religious belief. It sought to shape every aspect of its members' lives through carefully crafted publications that presented corporate guidance as divine wisdom. Personal decisions that in other religious contexts might be left to individual conscience were systematically addressed through organizational literature. The distribution system that Knorr developed was equally sophisticated. Rather than relying on commercial bookstores or traditional religious channels, he created a complete parallel distribution network operated by volunteer labor. Every Jehovah's Witness became a sales representative for organizational literature, personally responsible for distributing materials and collecting donations. This approach provided enormous cost savings while ensuring that literature distribution became a form of ongoing indoctrination for distributors. The psychological impact of this comprehensive publishing program was profound. Constant exposure to organizational literature created mental environments where independent thinking became increasingly difficult. Alternative viewpoints were systematically excluded, creating information bubbles that reinforced organizational perspectives while filtering out contradictory data. The publishing empire became a tool for manufacturing consent on a massive scale. Quality control in the publishing operation extended beyond technical editing to include ideological conformity. Materials were reviewed not just for accuracy and clarity, but for their potential to generate unauthorized questions or independent thinking. The goal was to create literature that would guide readers toward predetermined conclusions while maintaining the illusion of personal study and reflection. While Knorr excelled at administration and organization, he was not a theologian, and he possessed neither the inclination nor the ability to develop doctrinal content. This limitation led to one of the most significant partnerships in Watchtower history: his collaboration with Franz. The relationship between these two men represented a perfect merger of complementary skills that would shape the organization for decades. Where Knorr provided corporate structure and systematic expansion, Franz supplied doctrinal content and prophetic interpretation. This division of labor proved extraordinarily effective from an organizational standpoint, but it also revealed the increasingly artificial separation between spiritual and administrative functions within the organization. Franz could focus on creating compelling doctrinal content without worrying about practical implementation, while Knorr could concentrate on building distribution systems without becoming bogged down in theological complexities. The partnership worked because both men understood their respective roles and respected each other's expertise. Franz recognized that his theological insights were useless without Knorr's organizational machinery to disseminate them effectively. Knorr understood that his administrative systems were empty without Franz's doctrinal content to give them purpose and direction. Together, they formed a perfect corporate partnership: the visionary and the implementer. Franz's role in the partnership extended beyond simple theological writing. He became the organization's chief intellectual, responsible for developing new interpretations that could maintain member interest and commitment in the face of failed predictions and external criticism. His elaborate prophetic schemes and biblical interpretations provided the ideological fuel that powered Knorr's organizational machinery. It was Franz who developed the prophetic interpretations that generated excitement and urgency among believers, including the failed predictions about 1975 that would later prove so damaging to organizational credibility. But it was Knorr who created the global infrastructure that allowed these ideas to reach millions of people simultaneously across hundreds of countries. Without Knorr's systematic approach to information distribution, Franz's teachings would have remained local phenomena. The Franz-Knorr partnership also revealed something crucial about the organization's evolution. Doctrine was becoming product, and believers were becoming consumers. The careful coordination between doctrinal development and distribution systems wasn't accidental. It was corporate strategy designed to maximize market penetration and brand loyalty. New teachings were developed, tested, and rolled out like commercial products, with careful attention to market response and competitive positioning. This commodification of doctrine had profound implications for the spiritual experience of individual believers. Religious ideas that had traditionally developed organically through community reflection and theological dialogue were now being manufactured in headquarters and distributed through corporate channels. Local congregations became consumption points for centrally produced spiritual products rather than communities capable of generating their own theological insights. The partnership between Franz and Knorr also created a dangerous precedent for the separation of spiritual authority from practical accountability. Franz could develop and promote ideas without taking responsibility for their practical implementation or consequences. Knorr could implement and enforce policies without claiming responsibility for their theological justification. This division of responsibility made it difficult for anyone to challenge either the doctrinal content or its practical application. The human cost of this approach became evident when prophetic predictions failed or organizational policies proved harmful. Franz could develop new explanations and interpretations to address failed predictions, but the systematic way these had been distributed made it impossible for individual believers to simply dismiss them as isolated errors. The corporate machinery that had spread the false predictions continued to operate, demanding loyalty and discouraging critical thinking even when reality contradicted official teachings. Under Knorr's leadership, the Watchtower organization pioneered what can only be described as a religious franchise model that revolutionized how religious movements could achieve global expansion. Like McDonald's, Coca-Cola, or other successful franchise operations, the organization developed a complete package that could be implemented anywhere in the world with minimal adaptation to local conditions. The franchise model that Knorr developed was remarkably sophisticated and comprehensive. It included not just doctrinal content, but complete operational systems, organizational structures, meeting formats, recruitment strategies, training programs, and quality control procedures. Every aspect of congregational life was standardized according to specifications developed in Brooklyn, creating identical religious experiences regardless of geographic location or cultural context. Each new country became a market to be penetrated rather than a culture to be understood. Gilead-trained missionaries arrived with complete operational plans that had been developed and tested in other markets. They knew how to establish congregations, how to conduct meetings, how to recruit new members, and how to maintain organizational loyalty. Local traditions, cultural sensitivities, and existing religious frameworks were treated as obstacles to be overcome rather than factors to be respected or accommodated. The franchise model proved remarkably effective for rapid expansion, but it also revealed the fundamentally commercial nature of Knorr's approach to religious growth. New territories were evaluated based on their market potential rather than their spiritual needs. Resources were allocated according to business principles rather than pastoral considerations. Success was measured by statistical growth rather than by the quality of spiritual life or community development. By the 1960s and 1970s, Jehovah's Witnesses were establishing footholds in countries where they had never existed before, often achieving dramatic growth rates that amazed both supporters and critics. The standardized approach allowed for rapid scaling without the traditional problems of maintaining consistency across diverse cultural contexts. A congregation in rural Africa operated according to the same procedures as a congregation in suburban America, creating an unprecedented level of organizational uniformity. However, this success came at a significant human cost that was often invisible to outside observers. Local believers often found themselves caught between their cultural heritage and organizational demands that showed little sensitivity to their background or circumstances. The rigid standardization that made rapid expansion possible also created environments where individual needs and cultural differences were systematically suppressed. The franchise model also created a form of spiritual colonialism, where local believers were expected to adopt not just religious beliefs but entire lifestyle patterns developed in a very different cultural context. American corporate culture was packaged as divine requirements, making it difficult for believers to distinguish between biblical principles and organizational preferences. Traditional family structures, economic practices, and social relationships were often disrupted by the imposition of standardized organizational requirements. Local leadership development suffered under the franchise model because local believers were trained to implement predetermined programs rather than to develop indigenous approaches to spiritual life and community organization. The most successful local leaders were those who could most effectively replicate headquarters-approved procedures, not those who demonstrated genuine spiritual insight or cultural sensitivity. The quality control systems that maintained franchise consistency also prevented local adaptation and innovation. Congregations that attempted to modify organizational procedures to better serve their communities were subject to correction and discipline. The franchise model required absolute conformity, regardless of local conditions or needs. The statistical success of Knorr's administration is undeniable and represents one of the most dramatic religious expansion stories of the 20th century. When he assumed leadership in 1942, there were fewer than 100,000 Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide. By his death in 1977, the number had approached 2 million, a 20-fold increase that dwarfed the growth rates of virtually every other religious organization during the same period. These numbers became central to the organization's identity and legitimacy claims. Growth was presented as evidence of divine blessing and doctrinal correctness. The systematic approach that Knorr had implemented was vindicated by its results. More people, more countries, more literature distributed, more hours spent in preaching activity. The organization developed an entire theology of growth that equated numerical increase with spiritual success. But focusing on numbers revealed something troubling about the organization's priorities under Knorr's leadership. Success was measured in quantitative terms that could be tracked and reported, rather than qualitative measures that might assess actual spiritual development or personal well-being. The corporate mentality had reduced human beings to statistics in annual reports, creating an environment where people became means to organizational ends rather than ends in themselves. The emphasis on numerical growth created systemic pressure that filtered down through every level of the organization. Congregations were evaluated based on their recruitment success and hour reporting rather than the spiritual health or pastoral care they provided. Circuit overseers and district overseers were judged by the statistical performance of their territories. Individual members found themselves under constant pressure to produce measurable results that could be incorporated into organizational statistics. This numbers-driven approach transformed the spiritual experience for individual believers in profound ways. Personal Bible study became preparation for recruitment activities. Social relationships were evaluated based on their potential for organizational growth. Family time was subordinated to hour requirements and meeting attendance. The corporate obsession with measurable performance invaded every aspect of personal spiritual life. The reporting systems that tracked these numbers created additional layers of pressure and surveillance. Individual believers were required to submit monthly reports documenting their participation in organizational activities. These reports were compiled and analyzed at multiple organizational levels, creating detailed profiles of individual performance that could be used for counseling, discipline, or advancement opportunities. The human cost of this numbers-driven approach became apparent in the high turnover rates that characterized the organization during this period. While new recruits were constantly being brought in through aggressive recruitment programs, existing members were often leaving due to burnout, disillusionment, or inability to meet the constant pressure for measurable performance. The organization was growing, but it was also consuming people at an alarming rate. The focus on numerical growth also encouraged superficial recruitment practices that prioritized quantity over quality. Potential converts were often rushed through study programs and baptized before they fully understood the implications of organizational membership. This approach generated impressive baptism statistics but also contributed to high rates of subsequent inactivity and departure. The statistical obsession extended beyond simple membership counts to include detailed tracking of virtually every aspect of organizational activity. Hours spent in preaching, pieces of literature distributed, Bible studies conducted, meetings attended, every quantifiable activity was monitored and reported. This created an environment where spiritual value was reduced to statistical performance, fundamentally altering the nature of religious experience. Beyond the obvious organizational changes, Knorr's transformation of the Watchtower created subtle but powerful psychological systems that shaped how individual believers thought about themselves, their relationships, and their place in the world. These psychological mechanisms were not explicitly designed as control systems, but they functioned as such, creating mental environments that discouraged independent thinking and encouraged organizational dependency. The constant emphasis on organizational loyalty created psychological frameworks where individual identity became inseparable from organizational membership. Believers learned to evaluate their personal worth based on their organizational performance and standing. Success in the truth became the primary source of self-esteem, while organizational disapproval became a source of profound shame and anxiety. The information control systems that Knorr implemented didn't just restrict access to outside perspectives. They created mental habits that made independent research and critical thinking increasingly difficult. Believers developed psychological dependencies on organizational interpretation of events, losing confidence in their ability to analyze information or draw their own conclusions. The constant stream of organizational literature provided pre-packaged answers to virtually every question, eliminating the need for personal reflection or investigation. The social control mechanisms embedded in Knorr's organizational structure created environments where peer pressure reinforced organizational conformity. The reporting systems, meeting attendance requirements, and service obligations created multiple opportunities for monitoring and mutual surveillance. Individual believers learned to modify their behavior not just in response to official organizational policies, but in anticipation of community judgment and evaluation. The prophetic framework that Franz provided and Knorr implemented created psychological urgency that made long-term planning and personal development seem unnecessary or even spiritually dangerous. The constant emphasis on imminent Armageddon encouraged believers to subordinate personal goals and relationships to organizational activities. This temporal manipulation created dependencies that extended far beyond religious belief into practical life decisions. The hierarchical structure that Knorr formalized created psychological deference patterns that discouraged questioning or challenge. Individual believers learned to submit to organizational authority not just in religious matters, but in personal decisions that traditional Christianity might leave to individual conscience. The corporate hierarchy became a substitute for personal moral reasoning and independent judgment. While Knorr publicly maintained the organization's non-profit religious status, his administration developed sophisticated financial systems that generated enormous wealth and power. The volunteer labor force that he cultivated provided services worth millions of dollars annually, while the donation systems he implemented created steady revenue streams that funded massive expansion and real estate acquisition. The publishing operation became a financial engine that generated revenue through multiple channels. Literature was distributed on a donation basis, but the suggested contributions were carefully calculated to ensure profitability. The volunteer labor force that produced, printed, and distributed materials eliminated most production costs, creating profit margins that commercial publishers could only envy. Real estate became another major source of organizational wealth under Knorr's leadership. The organization developed expertise in identifying undervalued properties, improving them through volunteer labor, and either developing them for organizational use or selling them at substantial profits. The Brooklyn headquarters expansion that occurred during Knorr's tenure represented millions of dollars in real estate development funded primarily through donations and volunteer labor. The Kingdom Hall construction program that Knorr initiated created additional financial benefits for the organization. Standardized building plans and volunteer construction crews reduced building costs dramatically, while the properties themselves became valuable assets owned by the organization. Local congregations provided land and financing, but legal ownership often remained with the parent organization, creating a vast real estate portfolio. The financial systems that Knorr developed also created dependencies that strengthened organizational control. Individual believers who contributed significant time and money to organizational activities found it psychologically difficult to leave because of their investment in the system. The sunk cost fallacy worked in the organization's favor, encouraging continued participation even when beliefs or enthusiasm waned. Knorr recognized early in his administration that a growing organization would face increasing legal challenges and that professional legal capability was essential for protecting organizational interests. The legal department that he established became one of the most powerful and secretive arms of the organization, developing strategies for dealing with everything from tax issues to child abuse allegations. The legal strategies developed under Knorr's leadership prioritized organizational protection over individual welfare. When faced with lawsuits or criminal allegations, the organization's primary concern became limiting liability and protecting assets rather than addressing victim needs or improving organizational practices. This approach would later prove problematic when widespread allegations of child abuse within the organization became public knowledge. The legal department also developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining tax-exempt status while operating what were essentially commercial enterprises. The publishing operation, real estate development, and investment activities that generated substantial revenue were structured to maintain religious exemptions from taxation. These legal arrangements provided enormous financial advantages that funded continued expansion. Intellectual property protection became another major legal focus under Knorr's leadership. The organization developed extensive copyrights and trademarks to protect its publications and maintain control over how its materials were used. This legal protection extended beyond simple plagiarism prevention to include restrictions on how former members could discuss their experiences or quote organizational materials. The legal strategies for handling dissent and criticism became increasingly sophisticated during Knorr's administration. The organization developed procedures for documenting and prosecuting copyright violations, defamation claims, and other legal challenges to critics. These strategies often had the effect of silencing former members who might otherwise share their experiences or criticize organizational practices. The international expansion that occurred under Knorr's leadership represented a systematic campaign to establish organizational presence in every accessible country worldwide. This wasn't a gradual, organic spread of religious ideas, but a coordinated business strategy designed to capture market share in the global religion industry. The expansion strategy that Knorr developed identified target countries based on factors such as population size, economic development, political stability, and religious competition. Countries with large populations and minimal religious infrastructure were prioritized for intensive missionary activity. Political considerations also played a role, with expansion efforts carefully coordinated to avoid conflicts with local authorities whenever possible. The cultural adaptation strategies employed during international expansion revealed the fundamentally colonial nature of Knorr's approach. Rather than allowing local believers to develop indigenous forms of worship or organization, the expansion model required complete conformity to American organizational standards. Local customs were evaluated based on their compatibility with organizational requirements, and incompatible practices were systematically eliminated. Language development became a major focus of international expansion, but the translation efforts served organizational rather than cultural purposes. Materials were translated to ensure accurate transmission of organizational doctrine and procedures, not to facilitate meaningful dialogue with local cultures or traditions. The goal was linguistic accessibility, not cultural adaptation. The resistance that the organization encountered during international expansion was typically treated as evidence of spiritual opposition rather than as legitimate cultural or theological concerns. Local religious leaders who opposed organizational activities were characterized as agents of Satan rather than as people defending their communities against foreign influence. Under Knorr's leadership, the organization developed sophisticated educational systems that shaped how believers thought about learning, knowledge, and personal development. These systems weren't designed to promote independent thinking or critical analysis, but to ensure that organizational perspectives dominated every aspect of intellectual life. The theocratic ministry school that was implemented during Knorr's administration provided training in public speaking and biblical knowledge, but the curriculum was carefully controlled to prevent deviation from organizational doctrine. Students learned to present organizational viewpoints effectively, but they weren't encouraged to develop their own theological perspectives or to engage critically with alternative viewpoints. Higher education became actively discouraged during Knorr's administration, not through explicit prohibition but through subtle pressure and practical obstacles. Young believers were encouraged to view college education as spiritually dangerous and unnecessary for life in the coming paradise. This anti-education stance served organizational interests by preventing exposure to alternative viewpoints and maintaining dependency on organizational interpretation of events. The training programs for organizational leadership were designed to produce administrators rather than spiritual guides. Future elders and circuit overseers learned organizational procedures and policies, but received little training in pastoral care, counseling, or community leadership. The emphasis was on maintaining organizational standards rather than addressing individual spiritual needs. The continuing education that was provided to adult believers focused exclusively on organizational materials and perspectives. Personal study was encouraged, but only within carefully defined boundaries that prevented exposure to critical scholarship or alternative interpretations. The goal was to create informed believers who could defend organizational positions, not thoughtful individuals capable of independent theological reflection. Knorr understood that organizational success required positive public relations and developed sophisticated media strategies to shape how the organization was perceived by outside observers. These strategies weren't simply defensive responses to criticism, but proactive campaigns designed to create favorable public impressions that would facilitate expansion and recruitment. The public relations campaigns that were developed during Knorr's administration emphasized the organization's positive social contributions while minimizing or concealing problematic practices. Press releases highlighted charitable activities, community involvement, and moral standards while avoiding discussion of authoritarian control mechanisms or human rights concerns. The relationship between the organization and news media was carefully managed to ensure favorable coverage. Journalists were provided with pre-packaged information and controlled access to organizational activities. Critical questions were deflected or answered with prepared talking points designed to minimize negative coverage. The legal strategies for dealing with negative media coverage became increasingly aggressive during Knorr's administration. The organization pursued libel and defamation claims against critics, not necessarily with the expectation of winning, but to create financial pressure that would discourage negative coverage. These tactics often succeeded in silencing smaller publications that lacked the resources to defend against expensive litigation. One of the most significant but often overlooked aspects of Knorr's transformation was the systematic extension of organizational control into family relationships and domestic life. The organization developed detailed guidance on marriage, child-rearing, and family decision-making that effectively subordinated traditional family authority to organizational requirements. Marriage became subject to organizational approval and oversight in ways that were unprecedented in religious history. Young believers were encouraged to seek organizational guidance when choosing marriage partners, and marriages that didn't conform to organizational standards were subject to community disapproval and disciplinary action. The traditional role of families in guiding young people's life decisions was gradually transferred to organizational representatives. Child-rearing practices were systematically shaped by organizational requirements that often conflicted with natural parental instincts. Parents were encouraged to prioritize organizational activities over family time and to use organizational disciplinary methods rather than developing their own approaches to child guidance. The result was often family dysfunction and emotional damage that wouldn't become apparent until children reached adulthood. The financial obligations that families faced as a result of organizational membership often created economic stress that undermined family stability. The constant pressure for donations, volunteer labor, and participation in expensive conventions strained family budgets and created conflicts over resource allocation. Families were expected to subordinate their economic well-being to organizational financial requirements. When Nathan Knorr died in 1977, he left behind more than just a larger organization. He left behind a self-perpetuating system that had become largely independent of individual leadership. The corporate infrastructure he had built proved to be self-sustaining and capable of operating with mechanical precision regardless of who occupied formal leadership positions. The organizational machinery that Knorr created continued to function decades after his death, churning out literature, processing new members, and expanding into new territories with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized his administration. Leaders could come and go, but the system remained constant, operating according to procedures and policies that had become institutionalized beyond the possibility of significant reform. This institutional permanence provided organizational stability, but it also made meaningful reform or adaptation extremely difficult. The systems that Knorr had implemented had become so deeply embedded in organizational culture that changing them would require dismantling the entire structure. Subsequent leaders found themselves managing a machine rather than leading a religious community, constrained by corporate procedures that limited their ability to respond to changing circumstances or human needs. The systematization that Knorr had implemented became so thorough that it shaped not just organizational operations but the thinking patterns of millions of believers. People didn't just join an organization. They were processed through a comprehensive system designed to modify their worldview, behavior patterns, and social relationships. The corporate efficiency that Knorr prized had created something resembling a human factory that continued to operate long after its designer had passed away. This systematic approach to human modification had profound implications that extended far beyond religious belief. Families were restructured according to organizational principles, career choices were made according to corporate priorities, and individual identity was shaped by institutional requirements. The system had become totalizing in ways that even Knorr might not have anticipated, touching every aspect of believers' lives with corporate methodology. The persistence of Knorr's system also revealed its fundamental inflexibility and resistance to human needs. While the corporate model had enabled rapid expansion during favorable conditions, it proved remarkably resistant to adaptation when circumstances changed. The very efficiency that had been its strength became a liability when dealing with complex human problems that couldn't be solved through standardized procedures. Nathan Knorr will not be remembered as a charismatic preacher or as the founder of revolutionary doctrine. He will be remembered as the man who dressed the Watchtower in the clothing of a multinational corporation, transforming a religious movement into a business enterprise that operated according to corporate principles rather than spiritual values. While Russell planted the seed and Rutherford shaped the soil, it was Knorr who transformed everything into a global machine designed for expansion and control rather than for spiritual nurture or human development. The transformation that Knorr accomplished raises fundamental questions that continue to resonate today. When faith is administered like a business, is growth a sign of blessing or merely the result of effective corporate strategies? When religious organization adopts the methods of commercial enterprise, what happens to the pastoral mission that supposedly justifies its existence? When spiritual authority becomes corporate management, what happens to the individual souls that were supposed to be the ultimate concern? The legacy of Nathan Knorr extends far beyond the Watchtower organization itself. His systematic approach to religious administration became a model that other groups would study and adapt. The merger of corporate methodology with religious mission that he pioneered represents a significant development in how modern religious movements operate, with implications that extend throughout contemporary religious life. For those who lived within the system that Knorr created, the questions are more personal and immediate. How do you maintain individual identity within a corporate structure designed to eliminate variation? How do you pursue authentic spiritual development within an organization that measures success through statistics? How do you build genuine community within a framework designed for efficient management rather than human connection? How do you recover from the psychological damage caused by systematic manipulation and control? The answers to these questions cannot be found in corporate reports or organizational charts. They require a kind of honest examination that the system Knorr created was specifically designed to discourage. The corporate machinery continues to operate with impressive efficiency, producing measurable results and maintaining organizational growth, but its human products often struggle with questions that no amount of organizational success can resolve. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of Knorr's legacy is how successfully it has hidden itself behind religious language and spiritual justification. The corporate nature of the organization he created is often invisible to those within it, who continue to experience it as a religious community rather than recognizing it as a business enterprise. The systematic approach to human management that he pioneered continues to shape millions of lives, but its victims often lack the conceptual framework to understand what has happened to them. The machine that Knorr built continues to operate with remarkable precision, producing predictable results and maintaining impressive growth rates. But for those who have experienced its operations from the inside, the relevant question is not whether the machine works efficiently, but whether human beings were meant to be its raw material. The corporate transformation that Knorr accomplished may have created organizational success, but it also created human suffering on a scale that is only beginning to be understood and addressed. Nathan Knorr's transformation of the Watchtower into a multinational corporation represents a case study in how traditional religious impulses can be channeled into corporate structures that serve institutional rather than human interests. The result is neither traditional religion nor honest business, but something hybrid that combines the emotional appeal of faith with the systematic efficiency of modern management while eliminating the accountability that normally constrains both religious and commercial enterprises. Understanding this hybrid nature is essential for anyone seeking to comprehend how religious organizations operate in the modern world, and how individual human beings can protect themselves from systems designed to process rather than nurture them. The legacy of Nathan Knorr serves as both a warning and a guide for recognizing when religious movements have abandoned their spiritual mission in favor of corporate objectives that may appear successful but ultimately serve institutional rather than human purposes.